Hello guys, welcome to the series of tutorials on Java J2EE. In this series of tutorials, we'll be covering Java Servlets, Java JSP, and we'll also be visiting some basics on Java Hibernates and Java Strings. And primarily in this series, we'll be covering Java Servlets. And this tutorial is also aimed at someone who has some basic experience on Java coding and someone who has worked on Java programming language. So let's get started with the Java J2EE servlets. First of all, before going on to the servlets, I want to discuss web applications with you. So what exactly is a web application? So a web application is any application that uses a web browser as a client. Suppose you're accessing facebook.com, one of the most popular websites these days, and whenever you open your web browser and be it any Mozilla Firefox, and it can also be Internet Explorer, and it can also be Google Chrome, or it can be any web browser, and web browser is also called as a client. And whenever you hit facebook.com and you press enter, that Facebook homepage loads up. So the client is used to enter the information, and the server is application used to store the information. And each website is hosted on a server. So whenever you hit facebook.com by using your web browser or a client, the request goes from your web browser to the server, to the Facebook server where that website is hosted. So let's take an example. Suppose this is your web browser. Suppose you are using Chrome, and you hit this URL www or just facebook.com, and whenever you hit enter, it goes, this request from your web browser goes to Facebook servers where Facebook website is hosted. Each website is hosted on a server, and this request will directly go to that Facebook server, and in turn this server will give back the response, and it will load the home page of Facebook. Home page where you can log in with your ID and password, and if you don't have a login ID or password, you can just create a new account. So this is what a client is, and this is what server is. The main function of the server is to handle the request which is sent by the client. In this case, our request was we wanted to go to facebook.com, and when we made this request, that request went to Facebook servers, and in turn Facebook servers gave us back that page. So you can see here, a server is a computer designed to handle requests and send data to another client computers over a local network or the internet. So a server is basically designed to handle the request. As I showed you, that whenever we enter that URL, that request simply goes to the Facebook servers, and that server handled your request, and then it sent the response as that home page. That was the response which you got in your web browser or your client. And there are many computers which are accessing, or many computers which are there that are accessing a particular website, and then that server handles those requests and gives the response back over the internet, and it can be over the internet or a local network. So this was the basic overview of what is a client and what server does. And this is the very basic model of that. Your client, this can be your web browser or any HTTP client, and in terms, if it is a web browser, this can be your Mozilla Firefox, Google Chrome, or Internet Explorer, or any HTTP client. And then this request goes to a server. Your server can be any website in which, or it can be facebook.com or google.com or any website which is hosted on a server. And in turn, this server interacts with a database. We'll see how this model works exactly once we go deep into the servlets. And now coming to the servlets. Servlets provide a component-based, platform-independent method for building web applications. Earlier I told you what is a web app. A web app is basically any application that uses a web browser as a client. Suppose now you were accessing facebook.com, and you were using a client or a web browser for that to access that application. So Facebook is kind of a web application, and servlets allow us to build these kind of web applications. We can create web applications with Java Servlets, and as the name shows it, or they are coded in Java, and they are the programs that run on the server and act as a middle layer between a request coming from web browser and database. Now I'll show you how it works. Now suppose this was our client or web browser, and then when we hit facebook.com, the request will go to the server where the website or facebook.com or any other website is hosted. Whenever you hit a URL, the request goes to a server where that particular website is hosted, and then in turn here comes servlet, and then these servlet will in turn interact with the database. So how this actually works out? First of all, here the basics are clear. You just need to make a request to any website, or this can be done using any client or web browser or any HTTP client, and then whenever you hit it, request will come here to the server. Again, taking that popular Facebook website example, suppose first time when you hit facebook.com, the request goes to the server, and then server will in turn give you the response, as you'll get the home page where you can log in with your username and password. And now you are on the home page, and again when you enter your username and you enter your password, and there's a button called login. So whenever you enter your username and password, you hit this login button, and when you hit that login button, again the request will go to the server, and in turn this request will be handled by the server, and database has records according to every user. For database is basically used to store the data, and in this case database will be having username and passwords for all the users, and in turn server will send it to the servlet, and servlet will be responsible for interacting with the database. So that's why it's a middle layer between server and a database. And now your username and password will be here, and this will interact with your database, and this will check whether your username and password entered is correct or not by interacting with the database. Code will be written here which will check whether the username or password which you have entered is correct or not. If your username and password will be correct, it will send a positive response to the server, and in turn server will load up your account homepage of Facebook. And if your username and password will not be correct, server will send a negative response, and so it will send that response to the server, and in turn server will send that response to your web browser or client saying that incorrect username or password. And it will ask you to attempt again. So this is how servlets act as middle layer between server and a database. Whenever request comes to the server, and then server will send, in turn it will send it to servlet, and servlet will interact with the database. And we can write the logic here to check whether the username and password entered are correct or not, and this will check that username and password by interacting with the database, because username and passwords are stored in the database, and if those are correct, it will send a positive response to the server, and in turn server will send a positive response, and your Facebook home or Facebook page will open where you can write posts and everything, you know that all. And if the username and password will be incorrect, this servlet will send a negative response, and you'll simply get a message incorrect username and password. So this is how servlet works. This was the basic overview. I'll tell you how to create this very basic application using servlets to check if the username and password are correct or not when we'll move later in this series of tutorials. So why servlets are used? So there are many advantages of using servlets, and there are many other technologies available in the market with which we can do whatever we just saw. And the main difference is that servlets outdo the other technologies are performance is significantly better. Servlets performance is significantly better because servlets are thread based, and I'll tell you how later in this series. And next is servlets are platform independent. As servlets are coded in Java, and as you know Java is platform independent, you can write once and you can run it anywhere, be it any operating system. It can be Mac OS X, and it can be your Linux, it can be your Unix, it can be your Windows, any operating system. So they are platform independent. And Java is more secure, and it has one of the most important difference is that the full functionality of the Java classes libraries is available to a servlet, as a servlet can communicate with anything like applets, and it can also communicate with database like I showed you earlier. It can communicate with the database. We'll be writing the code in Java Servlets to interact with the database later in this series, and it can also communicate with the sockets and RMI mechanisms. RMI is remote method invocation. And so these are the some of the advantages of servlets. So now again, as I told you, that it requires a servlet, or it requires a server to handle the request. And in this tutorial we'll be using Java Eclipse or Java EE and Apache Tomcat as a server to develop the applications. So first of all, we need to set up the development environment. That my Eclipse is open, and now we'll start downloading Apache Tomcat, and we'll set this up in our Java Eclipse, and we'll run it and we'll see whether we have set it up successfully and or not. And once it's done, we'll dive deep into the servlets.